I've been an openly transgender blogger for most of my life. And through those 16 years, I've had various degrees of confidence around my gender. Obviously, as a teenager, when I started my YouTube channel, I was very insecure. Resources for trans people were very thin, and I felt very alone, and that's the exact reason why I started a YouTube channel, because I wanted the ability to reach out and speak to other people who were like me. And during that time, it did feel very validating for people to use the right pronouns and to refer to me as a name that I chose that now feels so much more familiar to me than the one that was given to me at birth. But all that being said, long before I announced my gender to the world, long before me even being sure about my gender, a lot of people read me as a young cis girl. And it was very common for people to refer to me as she or her without me asking. And I remember being really defensive about this when I was a child. But of course, as I got older and understood my gender more, it actually became a very positive thing. So eventually, when I started to medically transition, it really wasn't that long before I was starting to pass, as we say, where people were simply looking at me and assuming that I was a cis woman. And frankly, this wasn't because of hormones or anything like that. It was more so that I started becoming more confident in myself as I started to feel less shame about being transgender. These days, I'm very far removed from that little teenager who needed so much validation. I remember I used to be a huge shut-in, and I used my transness as an excuse for why I shouldn't be able to participate in public life. But these days, I'm a relatively extroverted, relatively well-adjusted person who goes out into the world and is taken as their gender without much question. I say all that to say that I am an incredibly privileged trans person. In fact, the only times when I ever really experience transphobia is when I'm on YouTube. YouTube is the only force of antagonism when it comes to my transness that I have in my life. And I think that a lot of people don't understand that when I have conversations on here about being transgender, I'm having them because I don't often have these conversations in my daily life. I think that I'm able to speak so intimately and so bluntly about being transgender and about experiencing transphobia because it's not something that's constantly at my throat in my daily life. I think so frequently cis people are used to interacting with transgender people who have only been in the first few years of their transness, where they are really desperate for validation and it is so important to them that cis people agree about their gender. But for me, I lived a life where I've not really required that in order for me to function the way that I currently do. And so I always find the disconnect between how people imagine trans people to be versus how I tend to live my life to be pretty severe when compared to my personal experiences. Recently, I stated in one of my videos that I don't identify as a woman, I simply am one. And somebody left a comment that was something along the lines of, "Kat, I really respect you and appreciate your work and your videos, but I disagree with your statement that you're a woman." This person said that they respected me, but they disagreed with my gender. And I actually think it's pretty impossible to respect a trans person, but not their gender. Again, comments like this make me laugh because they stand in stark contrast to my daily life where I'm not used to being differentiated from a cis woman. I think that one thing that people don't understand about me is that in my daily life, I don't feel this need to announce my gender. I think you could probably get that impression from my YouTube channel because I talk so frequently about being transgender on here, but I'm not somebody who announces that I'm a woman and yells at people to call me by she and her pronouns. People simply see me and take me as that and move on. For example, when I was writing the script for this video, I was working at a cafe and I walked up and asked the lady behind the front desk where the bathroom is, and she directed me to the women's restroom without even a second thought. And that has been the answer to that question for most of my life. Now, I of course understand that when people say they disagree with me describing myself as a woman, what they're really saying is that woman is a term that they use to describe people who are designated female at birth. And because I am not that, that is not the technical correct term to refer to me with. But what I think people aren't ready to have a conversation about is the fact that while there are these people who think that gender is solely defined by their biology, that we don't tend to use biology as a way of gendering people socially. For better and for worse, gender doesn't work in a way where we're all walking around with our biological identifiers on our foreheads before people decide to put us in the inevitable binary of man or woman. What I've known for most of my life is that I've been more comfortably categorized in the woman's part of that binary. And as a trans woman who takes hormones every single day to address the disconnect between my gender and my sex, I'm very aware that I do not have the same exact biology as a cis woman. That being said, none of that has mattered in the way that people tend to gender and categorize me. When people tell me they disagree with my gender, all I can do is think about the way that I live my life now, how comfortable it is, how functional it is, how uncontroversial it is, and wonder what sort of life they'd like for me to live instead. When you start to dig beneath this, you start to see the baseline resentment for a person on the basis of their transness. A lot of times these conversations start to revolve around this idea that somebody is forced to entertain a transgender person's, as they often say, delusions. This is something that comes up a lot when we talk about people in co-working situations where a coworker transitions and they've been calling them by this pronoun and that name, and suddenly they need to call them by another name, and they feel like they're pressured to entertain this when they disagree. While I appreciate that some people don't like to be called transphobic, I think that it's worth unpacking what exactly is behind their disagreement. Because I think that when you unpack that disagreement, you'll discover that it's less of a disagreement and more of a dislike. That is indeed the subtext that I detect when somebody says that they disagree with my gender. When they look at the happiness I have in my life and they say, no, I disagree. And if not dislike, it's at the bare minimum discomfort or confusion. I think that a lot of these conversations are had because people are frankly confused by trans people. More of them are had because I think a lot of people are simply uncomfortable around transgender people. Oftentimes in these conversations, people will express frustration and stress around even having to associate with a transgender person. I know that people don't want to call that transphobia, but what else is it, if not that? In most situations, I think we would very easily see the bias in somebody who is simply uncomfortable with somebody because of who they are. I do think that there's a bit of an unrealistic push that some people have where they expect you to get it right then and there, and they're willing to yell at you for not getting it. I know for a lot of cis people, these are new conversations. There's a lot of confusion. This is, a lot to wrap your mind around. And so I do have a lot of patience for cis people who are still trying to learn, who are still trying to figure it out. But I think I can afford to have that patience because, as I've stated, I'm not used to having my gender invalidated every single day of my life. On one hand, while I think that we should still hold a lot of space for the fact that a lot of cis people are still growing in their understandings of trans people, I also think that it's very, very oppressive to ask transgender people to put a pause on their happiness and their pursuit of their truth so that society can catch up. Most transgender people cannot afford to live within the shallow confines of a cis person's conception of them. And so we opt to transition, to push forward, to live in our happiness, whether people understand it or agree with it or not, because at the end of the day, time is finite. And that's the clash I think we're having. Cis people frequently speak of my gender as though it's a two-way conversation, as though my life as a transgender woman is something that requires them to agree or disagree. Trans people have existed and will continue to exist whether you agree with them or not. Now that said, I think that we're still having some conversations about transgender people and how exactly they factor into society. For example, maybe you disagree with trans women competing with cis women in sports. Personally, I don't have much of an opinion about that, but I will say that I think it's a valid conversation to be had. But it's not a conversation that will end with a transgender woman's gender being invalidated. I think that one of the biggest reasons that people resent trans folks is that inherent in the idea of being transgender is the fact that we heard what our doctors and our parents told us we were supposed to be. We simply said no and made our own path. I partially think that a lot of transphobia can be traced back to the fact that trans people embody this inherent challenge to what most cis people understand about themselves. If they accepted transgender people, they might have to question the ways in which they've limited themselves or have been socialized to limit themselves because of their biology. And it's really sad to me to think that there are some people out there who want to limit transgender people in the way that they felt limited.